Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the 97 UX Things podcast. Dan Berlin here, your host and book editor. I'm joined this week by Annie Persson, who wrote the chapter, If Designing Survey Questions Were Easy, There'd Be No Garbage Data. Welcome, Annie.
Hi, Dan. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming on the podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Annie Persson, and I am an experienced design researcher. I have been working in the industry for a little over 15 years now. And in that time, I've worked for small and large software companies covering products ranging from technical illustration software, data management systems, e-commerce, and education technology.
Nice. And you mentioned concentrating in research. Are there methodologies that you particularly like?
Oh, I love all of them. In fact, my favorite is, interviewing and speaking to people. I absolutely love the people interaction, but I also really enjoy the song and dance of moderating usability testing sessions. There's so much that you're juggling in one session, and I really enjoy the challenge that comes along with that.
Agreed wholeheartedly. That's also my favorite part, and you mentioned exactly my favorite part of juggling and keeping it all straight and doing it right. That's can be so satisfying.
Yeah, it really is.
And can you tell us about your career trajectory? How did you discover UX, and how did you wind up where you are today?
Yes. So for me, it actually all began in my undergraduate years at Colorado State University. It was the first year that the university was introducing technical communication as a specialization in the technical journalism program. So what's interesting about that is, and this may be surprising to some or maybe not, but for me, I was kind of surprised by the fact that there was actually only one course that was specifically on writing. The bulk of my curriculum was actually focused on design for print and digital mediums, usability, and web development. And so, at the time, I didn't really realize that I was essentially getting a UX education, before the term user experience or information design was, really being used as a title for programs. And so when I graduated from Colorado State and entered, the workforce, it was about 3 years into my career as a technical writer that I was asked to lead a computer-based training program. And so as a part of that, my employer sent me to an e-learning workshop. And I remember when I was in that workshop just falling in love with the storyboarding process and the sketching and understanding the behaviors of how we learn. And so it was from that I decided to pursue a master's degree in instructional design.
Yep.
And it was from acquiring that degree that led me into education and technology. And so I would say probably the bulk of my career has been in the ed tech space. And I was really, really fortunate to spend a good portion of that time at Persson Education, where, I was fortunate to be on some really progressive project teams. And it was on those teams that I was able to not just be focused necessarily in writing online, help, because that was probably 20% of really what I did. But instead, I was designing knowledge-based systems and mining data for user insights, conducting usability studies for our student advisory board. And then I got to work directly with customers and be a part of our design partner program, which is when I designed and distributed my very first survey, which led me to wanting to write about my chapter because, did I learn a lot from that experience. I considered myself a good communicator. And when I got my results back, I really had a moment of, well, that's not what I wanted.
Right. Yeah, it can be really eye-opening doing your first survey when you just dive in like that. Absolutely. I'm guilty as well. Many years ago, I'm right there with you. That's a nice segue into your chapter. If designing survey questions were easy, there'd be no garbage data. So
Yes.
fill us in. How can we make better surveys?
Yeah, well, so essentially, I wanted to write this chapter as a quick reference of like best practices that anyone can follow when designing surveys, because there's so many like free tools available now, and so it's very accessible to us. And creating surveys can become a very quick and easy and economical means, to capture data. But on the flip side of that, it also makes it very easy to get it wrong. So my goal was to create a list of best practices that you can follow. And this is whether you're new to survey design or just a seasoned practitioner, that needs a refresher, so that we can all avoid some of those common pitfalls, that generate what I refer to as garbage data.
Right. Great. So, and that's so important because it's so easy to get that garbage data with a misworded or leading question. So,
Yeah.
what are some of those best practices?
Yeah. So, one thing I think that is very common for people to do is we're all, I think, inherently aware of time and wanting to get the most out of a survey as possible in the short amount of time as possible. And so, as a result of that, there's a tendency to put too much into one question and to combine a question using and. And so, one best practice is to make sure that you don't combine what would really be two questions into one, and that you make sure that you separate that out. And of course, when you start to do that, you will start to see the number and amount of questions that you have grow. So it's really important that you begin the process with first, identifying for yourself, what is it that I want to capture data on? And then once you identify what that is, you start to design those questions specifically around those topics. Another thing that I've noticed a lot that's common is overlapping ranges. So, for example, if you were to ask, how many times a week do you walk your dog? You might say, oh, 1 to 2 times a week, 2 to 4 times a week, or 4 to 5 times a week. Now, the problem with that construct is that what if you walk your dog 2 times a week? And if your option is 1 to 2 times a week or 2 to 4 times a week, whoever has the answer of 2 doesn't really have an option to select.
Yep.
And so whatever responses you get back, you can't work with. It's just garbage
Yep.
data at that point, right?
Yeah, and it may seem really obvious to folks that hey, don't have overlapping ranges, but you see it often where there are those overlapping ranges, and we want to make sure that doesn't happen in our research.
Yes, absolutely so. And, depending on what the question is, you can either use numerical figures and specify those ranges without overlapping the numbers. But sometimes, if you're trying to capture more attitudinal data, you can also just have a text field and let people enter in that information for you so they don't have to feel restricted by any specific range that you're providing.
Yep. Can you tell us a little bit about the analysis of that qualitative data that you're getting during surveys and how you go about pulling out insights from those?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple of ways to approach that, but ultimately what you want to do is you want to code whatever feedback you get. Now, if you're trying to get a sense of like something, that's aesthetic or anything that maybe can be just binary, you can assign a 1 or a no to it. But sometimes, and I find this specifically like with doing something with Microsoft product reaction cards, is you'll have a sense of these are all of the positive adjectives and these are all of the negative adjectives. But then you may have a group that is a little bit gray that you would put in your maybe column. So if you're doing something that's a little bit more attitudinal, or you're trying to get an opinion around an aesthetic and you're having people enter in their own, thoughts, you just would need to go and code it accordingly by what you've identified as being positive, negative, or somewhere in between.
Yep.
And what's really helpful about that as well is if you have another researcher to work with, you can help eliminate that bias by having more eyes than your own on it to look through. And Another effective measure with that as well, and this is definitely in the context of using like the Microsoft product reaction cards, is to include your team in that process of identifying what are those positive words and what are those negative words, so that you as the researcher are not the one who's generating that list, but there's an actual collaborative effort in creating that.
Yep. You mentioned the compound questions at the beginning in terms of making sure that your question really asks only one thing. Aside from the word and in a long sentence, are there other things people should be looking out for to catch those compound questions?
Well, there's a couple of things you can do. When you've identified your topics, you can, approach it from the point of grouping them by themes. That's one way to approach it. And then when you have them grouped by themes and you've identified the individual questions, there may be a question that's relevant based off of whether they answer, how they answer, whether it's yes or no or whatever it is. And so when you're in a scenario such as that, then you want to incorporate branching so that you can kind of then segue into something that's basically related based off of their previous response.
Yeah.
And that's a really good way to sort of capture something that maybe you originally had combined into one and to break it out.
That's a great point. Branching is an overlooked feature of surveys, and I love the idea of just breaking it out and branching based on a compound question.
Yeah, no, I love branching. I think it's a great feature as well.
Yep. So, how about some other best practices? You mentioned the compound questions and overlapping ranges. What else?
Yeah. So another thing that is really important is, to use very simple and familiar words. You have to keep in mind that, people have limited attention span. And so when you're creating these surveys, not only do you want to make sure that you are designing it in such a way that you're taking up at least, 10 to 12 or more around like maybe 8 to 12 minutes of somebody's time, but you also want to construct it so that, they don't have to work that hard at understanding what you're trying to ask.
Yeah.
And so a way to accomplish that is, again, to use simple and familiar words, to be as, specific and concrete with the terminology, and to make sure that, there isn't any degree of ambiguity in the meaning of the language, because more times than not, if you have that, then they're going to be interpreting it that way as well. And so one of my favorite measures to ensure that, you have the quality or level of quality of questions in order to get the quality of, responses that you want, is to conduct a pilot test. And pilot tests are hands down the best eye-opening way to understand how people cognitively work through a survey. And so, you can do this with your team. You can even actually, recruit family members if you want to, because the whole idea around it is to basically have somebody talk out loud about how they're reading the question and their thought process with how they understand the options presented to them. And what's interesting about that is you're not just getting a sense of how they actually understand what you're trying to communicate, but you're also getting some insight into the interaction design element of those answer options. And that's actually very valuable to know as well.
Yep. Sounds like you're essentially usability testing your survey.
Essentially, yeah.
It's a great use of mixed methods there, essentially. You mentioned the making the writing as easy to read as possible. Do you ever use like Flesch Kincaid or a certain reading level to make sure that it's as readable as possible?
That is a good question. I personally haven't. I've just relied on pilot testing, but in my former days when I was doing UX writing, I was definitely looking at, leveraging tools that would measure what the reading level is, because you always wanted to target a specific reading level to, meet mass audiences and literacy. But you absolutely can do that. That's an excellent point, and I absolutely think that would be a great thing to do to ensure that you are reaching a reading level that's appropriate for the masses.
Do you know of any ways that folks can do that easily?
There are tools that are out there that do that. I even know something as simple as Microsoft Word does do that for you. I do not recall to memory if Qualtrics has something like that.
Yeah, and I always forget that Word will do that for you. It's a buried feature, but you can get that.
Yeah, it's really fascinating if you ever kind of poke around and look at it. It even now includes, I believe, like the voice and tone of your writing, which I think is really interesting. I'd love to know how they measure that. Yeah.
So Microsoft Word is rating your voice and tone in your writing.
Yes,
Interesting.
yes. I know, right? I know.
Getting back to surveys, what are some other best practices that you want to convey here?
Yeah, so another one to think about is, creating your response options. If you're going to have a more quantitative study, you would definitely want to keep your responses all closed. Well, you want to have closed-ended questions. So your responses would be something to the extent of, employing Likert scales. You might want to do multiple choice, but you don't want to mix in too many types of response options. So if you have a ranking scale and a Likert scale and multiple choice, you're really just sort of, adding to the person who's taking this to have to think through different response options. So, the easier and simpler you can make it on them, the better in the quality of the answers that you're getting. And another important thing, to be conscious of, I think, is, just making sure again that you are very wary of the time, because if you wanted to include open-ended questions, you have to consider that in 1 minute, what can people answer? So maybe like they can answer 3 to 5 close-ended questions in that 1 minute time frame, but it could take up to a full minute for somebody to answer an open-ended question. So you need to just sort of factor in all those elements, which again goes back to pilot testing, because that's a really great way, again, to get a sense of, okay, I've designed this survey. I'm guessing from the amount of questions I have and the mixture of open and ended questions that I've included that it'll take about 10 minutes.
Right.
Well, you go and you pilot test that, and you might find it takes people only maybe 8 minutes to complete, or it might be 12 or 15.
Yep.
So that's another way to kind of gauge where you need to maybe scale back.
Yep. A good point about the difference between how many questions a person can tackle within a minute time span, whether it's essentially quant or qual. A shout out for saying Likert correctly, because
Right?
it has to be said in this particular podcast that it is Likert and not Likert. And shout out to Tom Tullis for teaching generations of Bentley students that, because he actually contacted the Likert family in order to find out the correct pronunciation. And so I think a bunch of us are particular about that today.
Yes, we are, and thank you for mentioning it. It is it's something that I always keep to mind all the time whenever I hear it said. So it's a really fun factoid to carry with you for sure.
Yes. That said, though, tell us about labeling Likert scales. Do you have any thoughts on best practices for labeling these to convey what they mean?
Yes. So, there's debating literature out there. And in fact, I think there was recently something just published that was kind of counter to a practice I personally like to employ, which is to keep it between 5 and 7 options for a Likert scale. But I did recently see an article published saying that having it up to 10, even as much as 20, really doesn't impact it. Now, that's, I think the nature of our industry, which is great, is that there's always going to be conflicting literature out there.
Right.
And it's important for us to continue testing, all of these, like practices. But for the purposes of today's discussion, I would suggest staying within the 5 to 7 range for any Likert scale that you're going to use.
Agreed. 20 sounds like a lot.
Right? I know. I think, another part that I think is important for people to know, and I see this happen a lot, is sometimes participants want to please, right? Or they want to do, what's socially acceptable. You don't want to give people the option to say, I don't know. There's definitely a lot of research out there that shows that, people will select it for either ambivalence or self-protection. So, another way to kind of to approach that is to instead give the option of not applicable or just, don't use. And that's a nice way because then people won't skip over the question and you've kind of, resolved that possibility of them just answering to, satisfy or please.
Right. And or that they don't have a better choice. I've seen
Exactly.
surveys where there is no option, or I don't do this, and people forget about that when designing surveys.
Yeah, no, absolutely they do. And this is an interesting example that I was actually, because you mentioned Tom Tullis, I actually was just in a conversation with his daughter Cheryl, and she was sharing with me something that she noticed from a survey, which was it was identifying gender. And now that we're in this awesome age of being so much more inclusive and gender aware, this particular survey did not just list out in multiple choice the options for you to select from, but they also allowed for you to select more than one option. And I thought that was incredibly awesome. I have never encountered that myself personally. So, kudos to Cheryl for sharing that because I think that's a really cool, tip and approach to think about when you're constructing your survey.
Right. It's not necessarily a radio button that we should be thinking about anymore. It is that multi-select checkbox. Yep.
Absolutely. And, just to sort of build on that, one thing I think that I personally like to do in surveys is to take them.
Sure.
Any opportunity I have to take one, I actually will click that button and proceed because I'm curious and I want to see how did they design this. And so it's a really great way to either identify, good practice or bad practice. Unfortunately, I think the survey design world can get a bad rep because there are unfortunately so many bad surveys out there, and a lot of people may not take the time to conduct a pilot test.
Right.
And so, unfortunately, the result or the outcome of that is that we tend to just sort of ignore them. And because we've all maybe have encountered a lot of bad surveys, the response rate, suffers as a result of that.
Yeah.
So I think, hopefully this chapter will provide some of those best practices and tips for people to be mindful of so that we can hopefully, make a difference and start a trend of creating more better designed surveys, right? So that folks don't feel so dismissive anytime a prompt comes up and just wants to take a few moments of your time.
Yep. Yep. Now I wish I had something like this that was quick and useful when I first started my, survey building years ago. So thank you for all of this.
Yes, absolutely.
In our final segment here, we'd like to get a career tip for our listeners, whether they're first breaking into UX or have lots of experience. Do you have a career tip for folks?
Yeah, I do. My advice is to be the CEO of your career development. And what I mean by that is you don't want to limit your experiences to the projects that, are either from school if you're still studying UX or from your actual current job. There's going to be limitations and you don't need to limit your experience by what you're doing in your work or school because UX is all around us, right? And so you can create a use case from all the opportunities that are really just like presenting themselves to you just from the experience you have from, your home appliances to going through a drive-in or a restaurant or even just like grocery store shopping.
Yep.
At the end of the day, it's all about your thought process and how you approach either research, UX writing, or design. And I think it's so important to expand outside of what you currently do and to continually develop yourself and look for those opportunities. And I only say that because I know for me personally, having been in educational technology for some time, I didn't want to become saturated in that industry. So I was always seeking and looking for opportunities outside of that. So I had more breadth as a researcher, and I could take examples from different industries and different approaches and bring that into how I think about my problem solving.
Absolutely. There's so much we can learn from research and design in different domains and applying it to our own work in the future. And that's what it's all
Yeah.
about is, as you said, design is all around us, good and bad. Learning from that and applying it.
Absolutely. And we become more critical the more we're in this industry, don't we? Because we're aware.
Well, I always say that this job ruins you.
Right. But you're surrounded by the best people in the world. That's what I love about our community is that everybody is so generous about giving. Whether it's just giving time to mentor, to share ideas and how they approach things. And I think that, it's important to give back and to develop those relationships. I think it's absolutely the best industry you can be in.
Absolutely. Agreed wholeheartedly. We're very lucky to be in an industry where people are so giving.
Yeah.
And that's what we're doing. We help people, and so we help each other.
Yes, absolutely. That's what we do. You're right.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Annie. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Dan. This has been wonderful. I was really excited about talking to you today, so thank you so much.
My pleasure. This has been fun. My guest today has been Annie Persson, the author of If Designing Survey Questions Were Easy, There'd Be No Garbage Data. I'm your host, Dan Berlin. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the 97 UX Things podcast, a companion to the book 97 Things Every UX Practitioner Should Know, published by O'Reilly and available at your local bookshop. All book royalties go to UX nonprofits, as will any funds raised by this podcast. The theme music is Moisturize the Situation by Consider the Source. And I'm your host and book editor, Dan Berlin. Please remember to find the needs in your community and fill them with your best work. Thanks for listening.